Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Townsend-Gard. I'm a law professor, and I just want to quilt. Today we have Judy Walker and Jill Eliot. Judy lives in New Orleans, and her sister, Jill, came to visit her from Coweta, Oklahoma. We were lucky enough to talk to both of them, and this lasts about an hour and 20 minutes. They have a lot to tell us. This interview is Judy and Jill are so funny and so fun, and you can just really imagine their family and their stories, and they have a family quilt guild. They're awesome. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the... Just a note about sound. This was one of our first interviews, and so I'm a little bit faint, but the real point is listening to them, and there you can hear them. The sound is okay with them. It gets better. So sorry about the sound, but we are working on it. It gets better with each episode. Even with sound trouble, though, this is really one of my favorite interviews. I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me who you are and where you are, both of you.
I'm Judy Walker, and we are in New Orleans, Louisiana.
And I'm Jill Eliot, and I'm here visiting my sister in New Orleans.
So I'm pretty excited because I've heard some stories, and I want to hear more stories. So let's start with a very beginning question, which is, what are your first memories of someone sewing in the house or quilting in the house?
Gosh, I remember our great-grandmother sewing on her treadle machine in her little house in Coweta, Oklahoma, where Jill lives. But she made blouses and stuff. And I know that our other great-grandmother made quilts, but I don't have any specific memories of her sewing. Do you, Jill?
No, and I think because we didn't live near her.
Yeah.
When we visited, she wasn't sewing at the time.
Right.
I guess my first memories of my mom sewing would just be sewing garments. So she didn't quilt when we were kids. She didn't start quilting until she was probably in her 60s, and then she just did a little bit, and then again in her mid to late 70s she started quilting.
Interesting. Yeah. What do you think the difference is, because I hear this a lot, what do you think the difference is between people who make garments versus people who make quilts? Do you think there's a different mentality or a different
I think it's
level?
a utility thing.
Yeah?
Yeah, you had to have garments to wear.
Right.
So I do remember our grandmother, when I was little, would use our clothes as pieces in her quilts,
Yeah.
And I do have those quilts with, pieces in them.
That's very cool.
Yeah, so I do remember, we called her Mammy. I do remember her making, I have the evidence that she made these. I don't have a lot of memories of her actually sewing them because, like Jill said, we were visiting and,
Right.
We were doing other stuff.
In Mammy's later years, I was living in Coweta by that time, and I remember her using kits. She'd like to buy kits and put them together, and she made pretty elaborate quilts. And then as she got even older and her dementia started in, her quilts got a little more interesting. I have a couple of blocks where she used like a Superman sheet that she cut up, and there were actually pictures like a little fist or his head, and she would put these in blocks. She would just use them randomly. Yeah. So she kept quilting until probably until she went into a nursing home in her later life.
Interesting.
Yeah. But I remember her, but there was only one side of our family that really quilted. It was our mother's side of the family.
And so you guys have really cool, interesting quilting family stories. Let me ask you then first, when did you each begin quilting?
when my son was born in 1989, around that time I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, and I had taken some classes. I always liked to sew, and I thought I would make stuff for his room, and I made his whole layout, and I took some quilt classes around that same time, and quilted some with a friend of mine, and made several quilts around that time until I broke my sewing machine, and that was sort of the end of that. I sewed for like 2 or 3 years in there. Mm-hmm.
And then I owned a sewing machine because Mammy got all girls a sewing machine when I got married. But I didn't really sew. I did do some handwork, like some embroidery and that kind of thing. But I really didn't start quilting until I was probably 45, which was... I'm 58 now, so 13. I've been sewing quilting about 12, 13 years.
And so why? Why quilting? Your family's super big quilters, right? You've got crazy quilting stories.
We always loved the quilts.
Yeah.
Even though we didn't actually do it, we loved the quilts and, appreciated them.
Yeah.
And followed them,
And I really don't remember why my mother and her 2 sisters, why they started quilting, but they started quilting about the same time. And that was also about less than 15 years ago. And they went to a quilt shop in Branson, Missouri, and they each bought a kit to make a French rose quilt. And being the thrifty people they are, out of the kit for one quilt, they probably at least got 3 quilts apiece out of that, because no scrap was left undone, and that pattern, afforded itself to that.
Yeah.
And then very shortly after that, my cousin Lynn and I started taking our mothers to see their sister. So our mothers are Bobby and Jimmy, and we started taking them to Tennessee to see their sister Billy. And then all of a sudden we found ourselves in fabric shops. And then Lynn and I couldn't resist. So here we are, all of a sudden, filling our basket with all this fabric, with never sewn or quilted. So the first thing I did was bought all this patriotic fabric, red, white, and blue, all Americana. And I made a bullseye quilt, raw edge applique bullseye. And it's still one of my favorite quilts. Part of it I cut out like when I was on a business trip, because I could just sit there and cut these random circles in my hotel room. And that kind of got us the bug. And then that became our quilting trip. And when we went, we would hit all these quilting, fabric shops. And one year Judy came up and joined us.
It's
and,
so fun.
So we all went fabric shopping, and that's kind of just kept up. We at least have one annual get together where we
very cool.
Shop, sew a little bit.
And yap about it. It's so fun.
Yeah.
So I was living in New Orleans by that time. This was like 2005 or 2006 or something like that, Jill. And so I was living here, but I was hearing about all this from my mother and Jill when I would talk to them. And so I would buy fabric and go to the stores here and get them little gifts and stuff, but I didn't really sew myself. So then I finally decided I was going to give in and go back and make quilts again after my little bit in Phoenix. And I immediately found out that the one quilt store, the great quilt store in New Orleans, the Quilt Cottage, had just closed.
Right.
And I missed their sale. I was so mad.
Right, so this was in like 2000. When did they?
I'm not sure what year they closed, but it was
like
around then.
2007, I would have
Yeah,
imagined, because
somewhere
we got
around that.
here And they were open for like a very short time, and then she passed away, and then
Yes,
closed, right?
yes.
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
kind of shocking.
So there was nothing on the South Shore except this one store named Scrap Happy that was out in Kenner. Did you ever go there?
No.
It was out in Kenner, and this lady ran it, but she had a really nice lady that worked for her named Sister Ann, who is a nun. And so Sister Ann taught classes, and I went out there and took a couple of classes from Sister Ann.
Very cool.
And made some stuff. And I went shopping different places, and then, would do it with Jill and Mama when we went to visit them annually,
I'm going to add, too, that back when Judy was quilting when she was in Phoenix, our mom lived out there, too.
Yes.
And she got Mom into Mom took a class.
Yes.
And they did some wall hangings.
In fact, she made that little wall hanging right there.
Oh,
She took a class in Chandler and made that.
Oh, that's great.
And Judy actually had ended up giving Mama all her quilting.
Yes, I did.
Equipment and stuff, all her
Yes.
tools.
All I had left was a rotary cutter and a ruler.
So Judy had to rebuy when she got into all of it.
Yeah.
All right, so let's skip ahead. So now it's a decade later, right? And so tell me about your quilting life now. What is your quilting life like now?
The quilting lifestyle.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, it's extensive. Well, I retired 2 years ago, so I can spend a lot more time doing it. Before I retired, I would spend weekends sewing. I would try to spend like one weekend day sewing, and I got a lot done. And I had joined a quilt guild here in New Orleans, which really helped. And before that, our family guild had organized, which we'll tell you more about that. But after I joined the guild here in New Orleans, it was amazing. I was working at the Times-Picayune, and I wrote a story about the quilt guild show that was coming up, the big Gulf States Quilt Association annual show, and I met this woman named Bonnie Photo, who's now one of my close friends. And she was the show chair that year, and I interviewed her. And afterwards, she invited me to join their guild, and I did. So I have learned so much through that group. It's just amazing. It's called Cotton Pickin'. And it's one of the oldest quilt guilds in New Orleans.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Weird. When did it start? Do you have any idea?
I don't really know. There are people in the guild who've been in it since near the beginning.
Amazing. And it's a closed guild, right?
It is right now. We have a waiting list because they used to meet at Scrap Happy. And then after Scrap Happy closed, they moved over to Denise Taylor's shop where we meet now, Maze and Me Quilt Shop.
Cool.
And it's such a small shop.
It is.
We have such a limited space to meet, and we have problems hearing each other because of the way that we're configured. There's not a way to be together as a group and hear each other well. And some people, like Sister Ann, have, are older and have hearing issues. So we had to institute a waiting list because we just can't physically seat more people.
That's really interesting.
If everybody comes, we have 3 members that are snowbirds. So they're only there, in the winter months. But when we've got a full house, it's just too much.
Interesting. So tell me what you do at the guild meetings. Tell me why guild. What's good about being part of a guild? What do you like about it?
I've just learned so much from them. We have a program, and we talk about different techniques or different ideas or things we've experienced. And through GSQA, we take classes periodically through their circuit teacher program. And I've learned so much in these classes. And also, in addition to the circuit teachers, when GSQA has a show, or every other year they have a show, and then the next year they'll have a big seminar, and they will get national teachers to come to these, and they will arrange for the national teacher to stick around to do like a tour through the region and teach classes. So I've taken classes from Melinda Buell and learned this incredible sort of more of a free motion. She specializes in these giant flowers that are like really different from piece quilts. And then I took Judy Niemeyer's class, and that is one of my UFOs I still hope to finish. So I've learned a lot through the classes, and also just from the individuals and from hanging out with them and sewing occasionally. And
So how important is community to quilting in that, with mean, how much of it is the relationships you're making versus like